Not too long ago, the Philippine economy looked like it was doing pretty great. Despite some fairly dysfunctional politics, the Philippines has consistently outperformed its regional peers, with rapid GDP growth and, at least since the pandemic, relatively low inflation. As recently as August last year, the country's central bank chief was talking about a Goldilocks economy with low inflation and rapid growth. Less than a year later though, and the tables have completely turned. Inflation is surging, growth is trending down, and the fiscal situation suddenly looks so precarious that earlier this year, one of the big credit ratings agencies, who basically assessed the likelihood of default, downgraded the country for the first time since 2005. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the Philippines' economic crisis and explain why it leaves the Filipino central bank with a difficult dilemma. Russia once liked to think of itself as a major regional power. Perhaps it still does. But with resources depleting and attention still focused on Ukraine, the country's broader sphere of influence is shrinking. So in the latest issue of our magazine, we unpack how Russia's influence in their sphere is slowly slipping away. That's just some of the 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. Now, at first glance, it might be tempting to chalk up the Philippines' recent economic woes entirely down to the war in Iran and the subsequent energy crisis. And, well, it's true that like most of Southeast Asia, the Philippines imports a lot of its oil from the Middle East and has thus been badly affected by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But this isn't the whole story, and the key thing to understand here, and the reason that the Philippine economy looks shakier than most of its neighbors, is that the Philippine economy was already showing signs of strain before the crisis. The peso was slipping, and GDP growth slowed consistently throughout 2025, going from over 5% year-on-year at the start to just 3% in the fourth quarter. This was mostly down to a scandal centered around alleged corruption over flood control projects, which had been rumbling on for a couple of years, but really came to a head in August, when, a month after severe flooding caused several deaths and forced tens of thousands of people to evacuate Manila, President Bongbong Marcos claimed that he had found financial irregularities in the contracts for the flood defense projects. Marcos's government launched an independent fact-finding commission to probe the allegations, and congressional hearings in the months since have implicated a host of public officials, including, it should be said, some of Marcos's family members and associates. In fact, late last year, the government's finance department estimated that something like 400 billion pesos had been lost to corrupt contracts. This scandal arrived in the context of some pre-existing political dysfunction, centered around a long-standing feud between the Marcos and Duterte families, which we've covered in a previous video. Anyway, this political dysfunction affected the economy directly by reducing government spending, which usually accounts for something like 20% of the Philippine economy. But it also had a series of indirect effects too. The subsequent protests, for instance, which involved tens of thousands of people, essentially shut down parts of the country, and the associated uncertainty both dampened business investment, which has come in negative for the past 3 quarters, and spooked foreign investors too, leading to a sell-off in the peso and stocks. As we mentioned in the intro, the country has since suffered its first ratings downgrade in over 20 years, and a number of large foreign investors have signaled that they won't return to the country unless the government introduces stricter reporting standards for state-backed projects. This is especially bad news for a country that has both a rising debt-to-GDP ratio and that apparently wants to lean more on international rather than domestic creditors in the future. Of course, the war in Iran and the subsequent disruption to oil and gas exports coming out of the Middle East then made everything a lot worse. The Philippines was more vulnerable than basically anyone else. The country imports 95% of its oil, with the vast majority coming from the Middle East, which is why the peso sold off so aggressively after the war. Furthermore, unlike most other developing countries, the state doesn't really cap domestic prices or provide subsidies. This is why households saw some of the steepest increase in fuel costs in the world, with petrol pump prices rising by more than 70%. Unsurprisingly, this led to a sharp spike in inflation, with year-on-year inflation rising from 2% in January to a high of 7.2% in April. But it also took a real toll on the Philippines' growth prospects. This is essentially because the economy relies more than most on consumption. In other words, households buying and consuming stuff. Consumption accounts for the vast majority of all economic activity in the Philippines, and in recent years has accounted for the vast majority of economic growth. According to World Bank data, for instance, consumption accounts for about 90% of GDP, a higher share than basically any other large economy, and far higher than peer economies like Thailand and Malaysia, for instance, where consumption share of GDP sits nearer 70%. This is in part a reflection of the fact that the Philippines relies more than most on remittances. That is, Filipinos working abroad and then sending the money back home. In practice, this means that economic activity is happening elsewhere, but the money that's being earned is then being spent or consumed in the Philippines. Now, this reliance on consumption isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's one of the reasons that, for instance, the Philippines wasn't as badly affected by Trump's tariffs. Strong domestic consumption means that the economy doesn't really rely on exports, so tariffs didn't really hurt. However, it has made the economy more vulnerable to sudden spikes in inflation, because inflation generally leads to lower household spending and consumption. This is in part because higher prices mechanically reduce purchasing power, i.e. how much stuff households can buy, but also because it creates uncertainty, which discourages consumers from making big purchases. This is exactly what seems to be happening, and is one of the main reasons that GDP growth fell to just 2.8% year on year in the first quarter of this year. This might not sound that bad if you live in, say, Europe, where most economies are growing between 1 and 2%. But that 2.8% reading was well below forecast, and the lowest since 2009, excluding the pandemic. Anyway, this combination of declining growth and persistent inflation, which is still running above 6%, has left the central bank with a difficult dilemma. Do they hike rates to bring down inflation, but risk further depressing growth? Or do they hold rates to support growth and hope that inflation comes down by itself now that the war in Iran is over? So far, they've opted for the former, and they've now hiked rates twice this year. This is probably the prudent thing to do, but the risk here is that this creates yet another headwind to growth, which has been trending down for an uncomfortably long time. The latest issue of our magazine is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I told you about one of the articles at the start of this video, but this issue is truly jam-packed with content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions that have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through our timeline, and reaching the ultimate question: has Trump created the modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss if Britain has become ungovernable. Then in our EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you'd expect, as well as looking at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss whether we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. That's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy today.